how I sketch faces at a 3/4 angle from my imagination in a way that shows believable proportions. Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a wonderful day and thank you so much for joining me for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my entire process for how I create quick sketches of faces at a 3/4 angle. I am sketching both a female as well as a male, and their heads are kind of in opposing directions because I really feel that it's important to get that practice in for both. Now, if you clicked on this video, it probably means you're interested in being able to achieve more believable proportions when it comes to your face drawings, and/or that you're interested in learning how to do this freehand as opposed to actually tracing over photos or using grids. Now, granted, these faces are very much drawn in my own sketching style. I love the unfinished look. I love adding in quick shading with alternative shading techniques such as hatching, cross-hatching, etc. However, my preliminary outline sketch that I arrive at before moving on to any sort of shading or details or textures or whatever it is, it shows believable facial proportions and believable location of different facial features within the head shape. And that's what I want to focus on today, because if that is not correct, then we should not be moving on to the other stuff. At least not if we're looking for a face to look believable, because this is the base and foundation for everything else. And the way that I learned about facial proportions and the three-dimensional structure of the human head, which I feel is essential in order to be able to draw heads at different angles and perspectives, is by using Andrew Loomis's books on drawing the human head. His books are amazing resources that I would highly recommend to anyone just getting started with portrait drawing or even figure drawing. He also has a book on that. This being said, I've heard from a lot of beginners just getting started that they find those books overwhelming. And something you should know is that by the time I jumped into his books, I already had a solid understanding of three-dimensional form and perspective. It's also incredibly important if you're looking to develop higher levels of realism to develop your observational skills and actually see what things look like in real life via reference photos or via things that you actually have in front of you in real life. Because if you're not observing, then most likely you're guessing. And if you're guessing, then that's most likely not going to lead you to very realistic results. Unless, of course, you've studied that very particular subject for a very long period of time in all sorts of different angles, perspectives, light situations, etc. So even though I am drawing these completely from imagination today, I cannot tell you how many times I've actually drawn faces using reference photos or by having someone in front of me in real life. The main two reasons why I really love Loomis's method for drawing the human head and face is because it allows us to visualize the human head structure as a three-dimensional form and not as a flat shape, which is so important. And the second reason is because it allows us to practice actually placing our different guidelines in appropriate places before adding in our facial features in order to ensure that we're placing them effectively within the head shape. The very first thing that I like starting off with is a circle. And in his books, Loomis divides the human head into two main parts or components, the cranium and the mandible. And this circle or this sphere that I start off with is the cranium. Just as a quick note, make sure that you're creating all of these lines very, very lightly because you're going to be erasing them once they have served their purpose. I'm very sorry if this is very light right now. It's going to get darker in a moment. But this is the lightness that I use so that I'm able to erase my mistakes along the way and not end up with a huge mess. Now, our craniums are not perfect spheres, obviously. They are flattened on either side. And if today we were drawing a completely flat forwards-facing face, then we would need to remove or slice off two little parts on either side of the head. But because we're working on a 3/4 angle today, and we're only able to see part of one of the sides of her head and not the side that is facing away from us, then at least for now, at this point in the process, we only have to worry about slicing off that side of the head that we can actually see. And the way that we do this is by placing a smaller ellipse inside of the larger circle. The location of this ellipse within the larger circle, as well as how flattened or how much of a perfect circle it is within that larger circle, is really going to depend on the angle and the perspective of the head that we're drawing. I try to create this ellipse so that it has more or less 2/3 of the height of the larger circle. This said, I am not going for perfection. I am measuring everything out visually, and the refinements are gonna come along the way. All right, so after I have placed that ellipse in a size that looks good to me when compared to the larger circle, I then go ahead and draw a horizontal line right across its midway point, dividing it into top and bottom equal halves, and I pull that straight horizontal line all the way across the larger circle, as straight as possible. It may not look like it right now, but this guideline is going to tell us where to draw our eyebrows. All right, after having placed that horizontal line, we're gonna now place a vertical line straight down the middle of that ellipse on the side of the head, dividing this ellipse into right and left halves. So as you can see, we create 4 little quadrants or sections inside of that ellipse. In the next few steps, you're gonna see why this ellipse and the lines that we've created are so incredibly important and why we did it first. The next step is going to be to add 2 more straight horizontal lines starting at the top and the bottom edges of that ellipse and running all the way across the larger circle. So in other words, these 2 lines are going to be parallel to the previous line that we have just laid down. Now, if you were careful enough and that initial horizontal line was placed right in the middle of that ellipse dividing the top and bottom halves, these 2 new horizontal lines that you pull all the way across the larger circle should lead to creating 2 kind of equal little sections with equal height. The top straight horizontal line that we've added in is going to be our hairline. The second one, as I was mentioning before, is going to be where we add our eyebrows. And the one below it is going to be our nose line. Finally, we're going to add in 1 last straight horizontal line that is going to be our chin line. And all I did right there was I replicated that exact height or distance that I've already created in my last 2 sections downwards, going downwards from my very last line at the bottom, measuring that distance going down and adding that 4th line. So if you've been following along with me and you've been careful so far and have been correcting mistakes along the way, then you should have a smaller section at the top and 3 equal parts going downwards. Those 3 equal thirds are very important in order for our facial proportions to be correct, because essentially the height or the distance from our hairline to our chin could be divided into 3 equal parts. At least this would be the case for an average standard adult that isn't bald and has a medium-sized forehead. So we're going for the standard measurements here. If we were trying to draw a specific person, or you're trying to draw someone with very specific kind of characteristics, then all you have to do is slightly shift those guidelines and the size and shape of your facial features later on to better represent the person or the character that you're trying to draw. But in my opinion, it's important to get started with the standard kind of measurements and learn how to use the method. And then you can move on to shifting and modifying things as much as you'd like. All right, so for the next step, we're going to be creating more of a vertical line. It's not completely vertical and straight because it's actually curving around the cranium. You can see right there at the top that that's actually a curve. And downwards, it's also curving a bit because it's curving around the chin. I want you to notice how a large portion of this line that we've just laid down is parallel to the vertical line that we placed inside the smaller ellipse. If you find yourself lost in terms of where to exactly place this vertical-ish line that is going to tell you where to start drawing the bridge of your nose, then I would highly, highly recommend studying reference photos, preferably in this 3/4 angle that we're working with, so that you can get a pretty good idea as to where generally the bridge of the nose will fall in these kinds of angles. All right, so once that line has been placed, it's now time to actually start drawing in the shape of the jaw and the shape of the cheek and the cheekbone. As you can see, I use the vertical line inside of the smaller ellipse that we've created as a little guide and indication in terms of where to start drawing in my jaw. After I do this, I like adding in an indication for the neck and maybe the shoulders. And then we're gonna add the very last guidelines and we're gonna start creating our facial features. Okay, so everything is looking pretty good to me, and we're still missing placing two very important guidelines in terms of where our facial features are going to be. We're missing our mouth line and we're missing our eye line. So the first thing that you're gonna do is create your mouth line. And to do this, you're quite simply going to divide that bottom third of your face into 3 equal parts once again. You can see the 2 tick marks that I've placed right there to divide this lower third into 3/3 once again. The first tick mark that I placed is basically going to be the opening of the mouth. And finally, we're only missing to place our guideline for our eyes. And to do this, you're basically going to measure the distance from the very top of your cranium to the bottom of your chin. You're going to divide that distance into 2 equal halves, and basically your guideline for your eyes is going to be exactly in that halfway point. This guideline should fall a little bit beneath your eyebrow line, which was the first line that we started with. It's now time to get started with adding in our facial features. And if you've made it to this point in the video, I just want to congratulate you because that is not easy to do. Before moving forward with the rest of this drawing process, I would love to take a quick moment to welcome all of you new people just visiting my channel today for the very first time. I am so incredibly happy that you found me. And don't forget to subscribe because every single week I share a new video with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement for aspiring artists. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with placing our different facial features. I personally really like starting with the nose, especially when drawing faces at different angles such as this one, because the nose is kind of halfway down vertically, cutting that front plane, so to speak, of the face. And it just serves as a good guideline and a point of comparison that is going to help us with the placement of the other features. It's important to understand that each individual facial feature is a complex structure in and of itself. And I really saw a lot of improvement in my own facial feature sketching when I actually set aside the time to practice isolated studies of each facial feature. Like, I literally filled up entire sketchbook spreads with noses at different angles, with eyes at different angles, with mouths at different angles, and that was of incredible help. And when I was doing these isolated studies, I was actually looking at photographs. It's very useful to understand the different planes that make up the structure of the nose and how the mouth actually curves around the head shape, the different parts that make up the eye. There are so many things to know about each and every single individual facial feature. I 100% believe that if you make the time to actually study about that particular facial feature and make time for isolated studies that allow you to develop your observational skills so that you can recreate it in your drawing, even look for scientific videos, for example, of eyes that allow you to understand their structure and what the different parts of the eyes are for. That is going to allow you to just have a lot more information in your brain that is going to help you so much more than following a step-by-step tutorial that tells you just how to place a line here and a curve there and stuff like that. If you're following a tutorial, just make sure that it is the kind of tutorial that allows you to understand the actual structure and the planes that make up that facial feature. I remember sharing a video quite a while back in which I explained the process for drawing a realistic set of eyes and every single little component that should be included into an eye drawing to make them look believable. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that one down below in the description box for you. But what I'm really trying to get at is that it's very important to devote time to doing those isolated studies. Isolated studies made the biggest difference in my portrait drawing and painting. They allowed me to develop my observational skills. It made it a lot easier to actually tackle a full face. And I noticed that the overall outcomes were just a lot more effective. I feel that a lot of beginner artists out there don't devote enough time to isolated studies, breaking apart whatever kind of subject they like to draw or paint, which is incredibly helpful and, at least in my opinion, absolutely essential. As you can see, I am still drawing very, very lightly, and I am starting with those largest shapes and making my way towards specifics only after I feel that that largest shape and its size and its location within space is good. So I'm not starting to add in textures or shading or even tiny smallest details until those largest shapes are spot on to me. Something that's important to consider when we're drawing faces at different angles is that there's always at least a tiny little bit of foreshortening going on. This means that a certain part of that head is closer to us as the viewer than the other part of the head. This, of course, is a lot more evident when we're seeing a face or a head at an extreme angle. However, even in this case where we're drawing this face at a 3/4 angle, this eye that I am sketching in right now is closer to us than the other eye. And sometimes, even when we're looking at a face at a 3/4 angle in a photograph, we're able to see that the eye closer to us is a tiny bit bigger than the eye that is on the opposite side. Not to mention, many times when we're drawing a face at a 3/4 angle, the bridge of the nose is actually covering up a bit of the inner corner of the eye that is farther away from us. And when it comes to the mouth, one half of the mouth has a little bit of a distorted shape when compared to the other half of the mouth that is closer to us. So all of these are things that I would highly, highly recommend studying from actual photographs so that you can better distort certain shapes and change the size of certain shapes so that you can better communicate that angle or that perspective of that head. If you find you're having lots of trouble with drawing in your different facial features in faces or heads at different angles, such as this one, then I would really, really recommend you practicing drawing them in a forwards facing face first. And once you're comfortable with that, then move on to drawing faces at different angles. Because the moment you start drawing heads at different angles, it definitely takes the challenge up a notch. Things are hidden, things are distorted, and there are certain measurements that you cannot do as easily as when you're just drawing a forwards-facing face. Quite a while back, I shared this very simple tutorial for beginners just getting started with face drawings. In that video, I take you step by step through drawing a simple forwards-facing face, and I was explaining in that video how in a standard adult head, exactly the width of one eye fits in between our two eyes. In a flat forwards-facing face, we can also add in two straight vertical lines going downwards from the inner corners of our eyes, and that is basically going to give us an indication as to where the nostrils would fit in, basically giving you the width of the nose. We also know that the inner corner of the eyebrows should align most of the time with the inner corners of the eyes. A lot of times I see beginners start their eyebrows way too close together or way too far apart. And with a flat forwards facing face, everything is just way more symmetrical from one side to the other, and things are just generally easy to measure out. I always recommend to anyone just getting started to start with a flat forwards facing face, to use the Loomis method to gain an understanding and just get comfortable with starting to add in those guidelines so that you know where to place your different facial features, and even start practicing drawing your different facial features with a flat forwards facing face. Then once you're comfortable with that, you can move on to the 3/4 angle, and from here you can move on to different kinds of angles. I'm gonna make sure to also leave a link to that very simple forwards facing face video down below in the description box for you in case you're interested in checking that one out. If you take this video back just a couple of minutes, you're gonna notice how I actually draw in the ear inside of the lower outer quadrant of that ellipse that we created in the beginning of this drawing process. That little piece of the pie or quadrant or whatever you'd like to call it is going to tell you where your ear should be located. You're going to notice that in the male head that I draw, the ear is going to be placed in the opposite lower quadrant or little pie shape. And the reason this is because the male's head is going to be off in the opposite direction, but the ear is always going to be in either one of these lower pie pieces. Okay, so after having placed all of my different facial features, I went ahead and added her hair in a very simple way. But something that's important for the hair with both males and females is that you have to take into account that there is a volume to hair, and that you should always kind of create that volume past the actual shape of the cranium or the head. Okay, so my outline sketch is officially finished. I very carefully erased all of the guidelines and the initial shapes that I laid down in the beginning that I no longer need. And I then switched on over from my HB pencil to my 8B pencil just to do some very quick kind of mark making and some alternative shading techniques just to add a little bit more contrast and style to this piece. As you can see, because I made sure to create all of my preliminary outline sketch very lightly, as well as drew my guidelines and everything else very lightly in the beginning, I was perfectly able to erase everything very easily, and I stayed away from damaging or scratching my paper in any way. All right, so we're now moving on to the male, and you're gonna notice how I go through the exact same process when it comes to laying down that base head structure as well as the guidelines that are gonna help me place my different facial features. And before leaving you with the rest of this time lapse, I just wanted to provide you a couple of quick notes that can help you make a face look a lot more manly, because I know that I definitely struggled with this in the beginning, as I have a lot more experience just drawing female faces. So number one, I always make sure to not define the lip shape as much as I do with the female. And I also don't shade them in as much. Number two, I make sure that the eyebrows are a little bit bushier and not as clean as with my female faces. And number three, oftentimes I don't even add in a slight indication of any eyelashes at all, especially if I'm just creating quick sketches like the ones that I'm sharing with you today. I don't know if you noticed, but one of the final details that I added into the female face is that I went over the top line in that eye, and I actually added a tiny bit of scribbling along the outer edge of that line, just to give a faint indication of eyelashes without actually having to draw them in. For the male face, I don't really do this step at all. Lastly, if you'd like to, you can always define the jaw a little bit more, make the chin a little bit larger or more angular looking, or even add a little bit of a dimple or a fold in that chin. You know, anything that you'd like to make that chin a little bit more defined or prominent. All right, that's enough blabbering for me for today. I really hope that you enjoy the rest of this time lapse for the male face. Alright everyone, that is it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I'm doing here on YouTube and allows more people to get to know about my channel. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you and I always read every single one of your comments. Thank you so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe because I share new videos every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and stay inspired. Bye guys!